Today, we have a very special guest coming all the way from Switzerland. Dr. Elham Manea is an associate professor in the Political Science Institute at the University of Zurich, where she is a scholar of Middle East politics. Dr. Manea also works as a consultant for international human rights organizations, advocating for secularism and free expression. Her recent publications include the 2016 book, Women and Sharia Law, and the forthcoming Islamism Mainstream. Please welcome Dr. Manea.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. I thought I would start first because the theme is about Islamism and different forms of Islamism. But I thought first that I would read from the introduction of my book, Islamism Mainstreamed. Specifically, as I realized that we seem to be very much polarized lately. So this is a kind of a homage to this type of polarization. There's something very peculiar about being neither nor. By that, I mean neither right-wing nor left-wing. Being in the middle like that elicits suspicious reactions from people in both ideological camps. What do you mean you're neither nor? You have to be something, right? Certainly, I stand for something. Yet this is exactly what describes me. Neither right-wing nor left-wing. I found it necessary to express this view in 2010 when I introduced myself to my colleagues at the Swiss Federal Commission for Women's Affairs. Whatever serves the rights and dignity of women, that is what I pursue. Pragmatic, yes, but principled. So please don't start pulling me into ideological battles. That's not who I am. If I don't describe or subscribe to either of these ideological wings, then what do I stand for? I stand for all of you. And the sum of all of you is none other than the face of humanity. And that is my concern. The dignity and rights of this being, the human. I believe in this humanity, in this dignity, and in these rights. And this is my creed, this is my principle. Why am I telling you this? I know you didn't expect, or you must have expected a different start to this presentation. We have a problem, a global problem, and it has a name, Islamism. But we are unable to deal with it because we are either unable to speak about it or busy fighting an ideological battle. Islamism tends to divide people in European and North American societies. Talking about it makes many people here feel uncomfortable, not because they don't have an opinion about it, they just don't know how to talk about it. Some are afraid to talk because they don't know much about the issue. They have an opinion but don't want to tread into uncharted territory. They prefer to leave the talking to those they think know more. Very often, the religious identity of those other persons qualifies them for the task. And very often, those who are most organized in talking about Islamism and Islam, they're not the same thing, are none other than Islamists themselves. Others actually do know more about the issue and are worried about it, but they are also afraid that if they speak up, they might offend Muslims. They certainly don't want to offend, so they hold their tongues and end up censoring themselves out of an odd sense of respect. Finally, you have those who are haunted by fear, ordinary persons. They too love their countries, their traditions and heritage. They see changes taking place in their societies. They don't like these changes. They know something is wrong, so they seek an explanation. But the issue is so complicated and blurred and confusing. When they talk, they tend to be angry, lashing out. In fact, expressing a sense of loss, a loss of identity. What complicates the matter is how it's being shaped by the ideological battles of the left and right. The left wing tells us there is no problem to talk about in the first place. Yet there are jihadists blowing themselves and others up in Paris, Nietzsche, Berlin, London, and Stockholm. But they're just disoriented, excluded youths. Poor souls. We have isolated them in our societies, and this is our doing, we. We with our foreign policies, we with our discourse of discrimination, we with our media that paint Islam as an angry, violent religion. We are the ones who should be blamed for creating these jihadists. In this ideological camp, you have those who acknowledge the existence of a problem, but are very worried that taking the necessary steps to address it will only supply ammunition to their far-right opponents with their us versus them discourse. They will be damned if they will let this happen. Instead of taking concrete actions in a differentiated way, they prefer to bury their heads in the sand. And their fear, honestly, may be understandable given the discourse of the far right. In every person of Islamic faith, they see a potential terrorist. Muslims, Islam, Islamism, and terrorism, to them, these words are synonymous. They stand for the same thing. They blame foreigners, migration, and immigrants for all the problems in their society and end up exploiting Islam as a shouting banner for their racist demands. Many who consider themselves part of the right side of the ideological spectrum shun these views and oppose them vehemently. They are in the mainstream, cool-headed. They may see the issue but are hesitant to take the painful measures necessary to fight it. Too complicated, too expensive. And it will certainly hamper their government's trade and economic relations with some of their best allies. Think of the Gulf nations. Here, money does much of the talking. On both sides of the spectrum, the focus is on the violent form of Islamism, on the jihadists, the terrorists, those who are committing acts of violence. They are not concerned about the nonviolent forms of Islamism, the ideology and its religious message that paved the ground for this violence. That lack of concern complicates the matter enormously. And complex is not what they need. They need simple answers, simple solutions. So it's not cancer we're dealing with, it's a simple headache. Just swallow this tablet and you will feel better. End of discussion. But that won't do. Simple answers and solutions are the formula, in my opinion, for disaster. They will only encourage the polemics of the far right. The ideology of Islamism is the core of the matter, and it is what matters. Do you see why I had to tell you at the very beginning where I stand? We have a problem, a global problem, and it has a name, Islamism. But we are unable to deal with it because we are either unable to talk about it or busy fighting an ideological battle. And this clouds our judgment, makes us complicit directly and indirectly in mainstreaming Islamism, a totalitarian ideology. While we are busy bickering with each other, we fail to notice the slow changes taking place in our societies and how they are slowly eroding the major achievements of Western societies. The liberal and universal norms and values that protect the dignity and rights of the individual. So I thought basically with that, I would just try to position myself so you understand where I come from. You know, I thought that you have the right also to understand that I'm neither right nor left, and I'm here to talk about an issue that I researched. And given the fact that I've been talking about nonviolent Islamism, I thought perhaps it would be good also if I define what I mean with nonviolent Islamism. I'm actually speaking about two forms. But first of all, when I talk about nonviolent Islamism, I think of it as a spectrum. Think of it as a spectrum, at the end of which you have the violent form of it. But the most important part is that it's an ideology of political Islam and a radical interpretation of religion. It's not only an ideology, it's also an interpretation, a fundamentalist interpretation of religion. It's a religious far-right group we're talking about. In order for us to understand what we're talking about, if I talk about these forms of Islamism, then I speak, in fact, about religious far-right group in different forms. And the forms, I start with societal Islamism. These are new fundamentalist movements. Think of Wahhabi Salafi Islam, which was created in the 18th century by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in Saudi Arabia, the heart of Najd. Think of the Deobandi movement, another movement also created in the 18th century, but in the South Asian context. And it's one that is basically focuses very much on social behavior. They focus on the members of these movements, how they behave, how should they basically live. Everything will be basically controlled and structured. I will give you also an example when I talk about my own experience, because what I went through was a combination of Muslim Brotherhood ideology based on a Salafi interpretation of Islam. Most importantly, this type of Islamism leads to separation because they act like a cult, like a sect. And if you enter in this group, you are demanded to separate yourself from the influence of the wider society. Most important as well, if I'm going to talk about Wahhabi Salafi movement, is to understand that the theological principles pave the ground for the division that comes about because of it. Wherever this type of reading of Islam spread within a society, division is the outcome. Minorities, women will suffer. One principle tells the followers that those living in their society are living in ignorance, jahiliyyah. It makes no difference which society we're talking about. Is it Muslim society or non-Muslim society? You're living in jahiliyyah, in ignorance, and those who are living in these society are not following the real way of believing in God and the oneness of God. How do you address God is the most important one. And if you don't follow that way of oneness, of belief in oneness of God, of how you address God, you end up in a situation where basically you're considered a non-believer. Whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim makes no difference. So takfir, the excommunication, becomes a kind of like very much part of the worldview. And then you have the concept of al-wala wal-bara'a, which is basically you have to be loyal to whatever is part of your reading of Islam, and disloyal to all of those who don't believe. That reflects, for instance, within a Western context, you're not allowed to celebrate birthdays, you're not allowed to wish people of other faiths Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. You're not allowed to do that, okay? And jihad is very much part of it. Of course, when we talk about Salafi movements, you have different strands of Salafism. Nevertheless, in all of these different strands, the concept of jihad, waging a holy war, is very much integral to the worldview. The question is basically, when do you use it? When did you use that violence? And then societal Islamism, you have political Islamism. It's an ideology, a modern ideology, one that came about in the 20th century. And you have several forms of Muslim Brotherhood, which was created in 1928. Jama'at al-Islamiyya, created also in the South Asian context. And its most important feature is never to forget that this ideology is based on a religious interpretation of one of these forms here, of societal Islamism. So Muslim Brotherhood, they are Salafi in creed. Jama'at al-Islamiyya, you have a combination of Ahl al-Hadith, but also the Deobandi movement. Once you realize that, you understand we're not only talking about a political movement. We're talking about a political movement based on a religious interpretation. And the aim is domination. Now, the common goals of the two types of Islamism show why I say we are dealing with a religious far-right group. On the one hand, society has to be governed by what they considered God's law, Islamic law. Islamic law are jurisprudence rules that were promulgated between the 7th and the 10th century. And you can imagine that it was shaped by the historical period of that time. So it doesn't really respect the dignity and rights of a human being. It doesn't acknowledge the concept of citizenship. Okay? In fact, when we talk about citizenship, identity and citizenship are based and defined by religious affiliation and observance. Now, just switch the word religious affiliation and observance with race. Then you see, what are we talking about? Then you will see what we're talking about. A state run by a chosen supreme group of Muslims, and it doesn't make any difference if we're talking about Sunni or a Shia political Islam here, you know? Because at the end of the day, the group and their religious interpretation are supposed to be at the top of that pyramid of citizenship. Everybody else comes afterwards. And you have concepts of military and missionary jihad. There are times to use missionary jihad, and there are other times to use military jihad. Violence is very much part of it. And unfortunately, accordingly, it's just like you see the world is divided into camps. It's believers and non-believers, you know. And that makes it very difficult from that perspective. Most important, when they share two common features. So one of them is basically when they start with the woman and control of her behavior and body in their preaching of an Islamist word. and both seek to change society gradually through a process of Islamizing society by means of the education system, the mosque, the religious teachings, and the media. So these are actually the structures. When I say we are talking about an ideology, structure, and a system. And through that, through these structures, you actually mainstream a certain ideology. And that was done in different contexts, in Muslim majority countries, and also in certain communities, migrant communities of Islamic faith in Western democracies. How the two types differ: societal Islamism lacks a systematic political ideology, not concerned with state building. It's a reading of Islam. You have lots and lots and lots of rules, okay? This is the one that gives it shape, structure, system, strategy, political Islam. And political Islam always insists on what? On group identity. Don't talk to us that we are people coming from different nations. We don't have nationalities. No. We are an ummah, and an ummah united. We are one group. We are Muslims. And they often insist we are the speaker of the Muslims. And what they demand, in fact, reflect their Islamist ideology and demands. I told you I had a personal experience with this ideology, with this religious interpretation, and it was actually, it took place when I was 16 years old. Okay. And you have to understand my background. I'm a daughter of a Yemeni diplomat, born in Egypt. My mother is half Egyptian, half Yemeni, and we've been traveling all our lives, okay? And when I arrived at 16 in Yemen, it was the 80s. And the 80s was the period where you actually witnessed the height of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was the president. At the time, he had the Reagan doctrine, where he basically said we have to support freedom fighters in their fight against communism. The freedom fighters included the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And the Mujahideen, as you know, are the forefather of Al-Qaeda and Taliban groups, okay? So that was the time when there was actually a close cooperation between the United States, between certain Muslim countries, and between Islamists in fighting an ideology. That ideology was communism. And at the same time, Yemen, I'm talking about North Yemen. I come from North Yemen, okay? North Yemen was very much part of that Cold War. South Yemen was a communist state, the only communist state in the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, okay? And North Yemen was considered the gate that is more or less protecting the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia. And south of Yemen was so intent, being very much also part of the Soviet Union's camp of exporting its ideology, its revolution to the region. Okay? So that was a period where Saudi Arabia, in its fight against communism, together with the United States, was exporting its line of religion as an antidote to communism. And that has led to what? Creation of structures, mosques, madrasas, teaching this type of reading of Islam Yemen had different kind of denominations, Zaydi and Shafi'i. Interestingly, north of Yemen, at the beginning, before this whole thing started, they used to teach children 1 hour weekly of ethics emanating from religion. Very beautiful kind of ethics, love you. But afterwards, given the fact that the state became very much part of this alliance against communism, they changed the curriculum to 8 hours of hardcore Salafi Wahhabi Islam. And it was actually indoctrinating children. That was the moment when I came to Yemen, north of Yemen. I was in a girls' school, and there I saw that there was a group of girls, young women, this is 16, 17, 18, always meeting in circles, and someone is preaching. A charismatic young lady was teaching. And I asked, who are they? They said, these are pious sisters teaching about Islam. So I joined. Okay. At the beginning, it was a very beautiful message. It was really beautiful message. It's about love. God is loving. Love your neighbor. You know, when you see something thrown in the street that could harm people, just take it away. It was a beautiful, inclusive kind of message at the beginning. God is loving, but you have to follow the right path to God. Okay? Apparently, our society at that time, according to that message, was not really Muslim. They are following a deviant form of Islam. Okay? At the same time, the message took a different tone, telling me, don't worry, we know that this is a deviant form of Islam, but you are going to be forgiving if you just take this form of Islam. Once you do, all of your sins will be erased. You will be a kind of a born-again Muslim. Okay? So I became a born-again Muslim. And as a born-again Muslim, I needed a booklet, more or less, of rituals. How do you pray? You know, saying, what do you say when you go to the bathroom? When you eat? When you leave the house? With which foot you enter the bathroom? On which side you relieve yourself? With which hand you eat? Everything in booklets, small booklets, like tablets. Instructions. When you pray, you have to pray this way. Dare you to do it this way. If you do it this way, you will be what? It's like a Shia. And this type of religious interpretation doesn't look favorably to other forms of Islam. It started to change me. You could see that change. You have to wear the headscarf. I didn't want to wear the headscarf. But it's like hell is filled with women held by their hair because they seduce these poor men. You know? I didn't want to wear it, but nevertheless, for the love of God, I did it. The message started to take, as I said, it's like you could see the changes visibly, but also in the way I started to speak. I used to say, the Egyptian, because my dialect is actually Egyptian, I would say, good morning, good evening, sabah al-khair, masa al-khair. You have to use the greeting of Islam, Assalamu alaikum. And you only say it to the Muslims, the real Muslims. And interestingly, you had this kind of like a warning, don't say it to non-Muslim because we're not at peace with them. Okay? The message started also to take like a kind of like right and wrong, good and bad, music, poetry, TV, sculpture, philosophy. All of these are haram, forbidden. Okay? That said, it started to take a political tone. Booklets about Khalid al-Islamboli, who assassinated President Anwar Sadat. Apparently, the man is a hero. He made peace with Israel, and he cooperated with the enemies of Islam, so he deserves to be killed. Books of writers, well-known writers. I didn't know that at the time. I actually thought what I'm being given is religion. But when you look at the type of the literature that was given to me at that time, work of the creator, the founder of Jama'at al-Islamiyya, Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, the book, the milestone, is considered the manual for jihadi Islamists. That book I read when I was 16 years old. And the book is telling me that the whole society that I'm living in, all of these societies are living in ignorance, and it's okay to fight them. It is okay to fight them. So the tone started to change, and with it also the message where you feel that you are being transported. You are not Elham Manea, Yemeni, Egyptian person within her own community. No, you are actually right now transported into the time of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. You see, we are in a kind of a fight, and I'm part of it. I'm like the companions of Muhammad. My mother is following a deviant form of Islam, despite the fact that she had the most loving way of belief. Just like you do what you have to do, you love God and God loves you back. And you don't hate anybody, you know? And at the same time, my father, who was a freethinker, I'll put it this way, started to be very critical when he came back from Morocco. He found me a different person. And when he found me as a different person, he started to discuss with me, and he realized something is really definitely wrong with me because I started to try to convert him to Islam. And at the same time, he would basically tell me, I understand that in your age, you're looking for something, and religion might be that something. But this is not religion, this is fundamentalism. And I would be angry, and I would raise my voice, and I would fight with him. And then I would go back to my group, and I would tell them. And then they would tell me, and that's just, I think they got the wrong tone there, because it started to wake me up. They started to tell me, you know, the companions of Muhammad had to sometimes to renounce their parents, their fathers, their sons, fight them in the battlefield, killing them. And your father is an enemy of Islam accordingly. And that was, in fact, the wrong message to give me, you know, because it started to make me awake. And finally, I think it was a gender message that was given to me that made me realize that something very much is wrong with this group. And because we were meeting regularly at the school, but then that changed, and I found myself meeting regularly outside of the school with the group in a structure. And then in one meeting, there was an older woman, and she was telling us, of course we are sisters, by the way, so we were told we are sisters. The lady was talking to us about the duties of wives, how to be a good wife, and that you can actually get to heaven if you obeyed your husband. But the message that came afterwards was the one that made me really, actually I was very angry when I heard it. It was basically a saying. They claim to say that the Prophet, that there was a woman, a wife, wanting to visit her father, sick father. The husband said no. She went anyway, and then the Prophet said that the angels are cursing this woman because she disobeyed her husband. And I got, well, I have a certain background, and I have a certain wound that has to do with my mother. And when they said that, I was just thinking, now, who should be cursed here, for God's sake? That woman who wanted to visit her father, or this bloody husband who doesn't have mercy in his heart? Okay? And I left, and I knew I will not come back. And it was in a matter of 6 to 8 months that this process took place. 6 to 8 months that I was so changed. And luckily, I woke up, because it was as if I was under a spell. And I woke up. Okay? Now, if you allow me, I will just basically I will try to make some remarks on this experience. If you think of radicalization as a spectrum, the end of which is the act of violence, what I experienced was a cognitive radicalization, one that actually can pave the ground for the violence that is yet to come. Because if you see violence, we would never ask to commit violence, but violence was given as part of a world view, as legitimate. And it was basically part of a narrative about world divided into two camps, one of them a victim under attack, fighting against forces of evil. And fighting back, committing acts of violence, seems to be very glorious. An act that would be rewarded generously in the afterlife. Martyrdom and the booklets that we received about martyrdoms were very important in that respect. I'm not here to defend anybody. I'm very critical of foreign policies of different administrations of the United States, okay? But I have to put it this way. Western foreign policy did not bring this ideology into existence. The Wahhabi Islam was basically, was created in the 18th century. Muslim Brotherhood was created in the 1928. And most importantly, it's important to recognize that we are dealing with an ideology that uses religion to gain power, and it will use any means to legitimize its narrations. And grave policy mistakes by leaders such as George Bush and Tony Blair are very useful in this narrative, you know. But that said, it's not the foreign policies of Western democracy that brought this ideology into existence. Why? Remember, there was no Iraqi war to blame for my radicalization at that point. It was the 80s. And the Americans were considered the buddies of the Islamists at the time. But of course, while they're doing that, the narration that I got, that we have enemies, and these, forgive me for the use of the word, the way I will put it, the Jews, the communists, and the Crusaders. And there was a logical disconnect because the Crusaders were also meant like the West, the Americans. But the Americans were our buddies at that time. So it was interesting how they more or less tried to tiptoe on this issue. Ideology is core. I understand that we have different kind of like scholarly kind of orientation when it comes to talk about radicalization, poverty, marginalization, current discourse on Islam. With all due respect, from my perspective, are not really the main catalyst for radicalization. If poverty is a factor, why aren't other marginalized minorities of different faiths in the UK or France engaged in their visions or versions of jihad? In my case, I came from an upper middle class background, privileged and educated. So poverty didn't play any role. But I had a problem. I had an identity crisis. Young, confused, searching for an identity in an Arab and Muslim majority society. No one was discriminating against me. The only thing is basically, in Yemen, they called me the tall Egyptian, and in Egypt, they called me the Yemeni. No one accepted me, and I didn't know how to sort also all of the other countries, Germany, Iran, Morocco. How do I put them together in one? Together today, all of the countries, the 8 countries that I lived in, they make the person I am. But at that time, it was so confusing. In Yemen, they didn't accept me. In Egypt, they didn't accept me. And then you have a message, a beautiful one, coming to you and say, you don't have to search for anything. You are one, a Muslim. You are one, a Muslim. So while personal crisis and the search for an identity are crucial factors in the radicalization of youth in our societies, the ideology behind it and the group propagating it, the social context, let's not forget it, are core factors we should also consider. And very important to mention, if I talk about the Muslim Brotherhood right now specifically, we are talking about a group that is so well organized. And it starts with this family cell. And I didn't know at the time, but the meetings that we had, it had a structure. And you have it in the literature of the Muslim Brotherhood in their organization. You start with the family, and you are part of the family. And whether it's for males or females, you are brothers and you are sisters, and at the same time, you have a leader, and that leader take care of you, of your religious education, of your political education. Make sure that you are separated, that you're not reading any literature that you shouldn't read. And this kind of structure takes you from one level to another. And I document in the book how they would take someone from primary school to secondary school, different families, different leaders, until they reach at the university. When you leave a country, say you're leaving Egypt to Sweden, you will get a number, and you will be basically asked to call someone in Sweden, and that number will put you in contact with the new family you're going to be connected with. Now, when it comes to this organizational structure, there's a hierarchy in the membership of the Brotherhood, and it's not easy to get in, but once you are in, after a vetting process, you are supposed to make an oath of allegiance, promising loyalty and obedience. And as I said, you have a very much sophisticated structure that spans from neighborhoods to cities to states into an international network everywhere. Most importantly, when you look at the Muslim Brotherhood curriculum, when you see what they teach children, you realize it's very problematic. It's very problematic what the children are being taught. So you see that you have a curriculum divided according to the age and life stage of the members. They teach different topics, the Quran, the sayings of Muhammad, jurisprudence, the seerah, the creed, through various activities and songs. Most importantly, you know, any religion have different sides. And in Islam, you have, and the Quran, you have the peaceful side and the violent side. And if you look closely at the curriculum of the Muslim Brotherhood, the one that is being taught to children, they focus very much on the violent side of this religion. I just put the names of certain kind of volumes for children that are being taught, but most importantly, they all disseminate this Medina Salafi form of Islam caught in a battle for the survivor of Islam. And I'll give you some examples here. Because in all the series, the teacher is told which messages to emphasize. You have to read these curriculums, honestly. So example 1. What is being done is that children are led to hate specific figures in Islamic history and then direct that hatred toward a general category of unbelievers. So for example, they will basically talk about the story of Abu Lahab, the uncle of Muhammad, who is condemned in the Quran as the enemy of Islam. Now notice what the instruction is. Tell the tutor to emphasize, I hate Abu Lahab because he was kafir, unbeliever, did not believe in Allah and the messenger Muhammad, and he used to torture Muslims. Then the instructions specify the following 3 lessons the children should learn from the story. Allah will put the kuffar, unbelievers, into fire of hell. The Muslim hates the kuffar and loves the Muslims. And the kuffar hate Islam and hurt Muslims. And another example talks about jihad. And jihad is done as a kind, they bring it from the stories of the life of Muhammad and emphasize that the Muslim obeys God and the Muslim loves jihad for the sake of God. Then they bring stories and tell stories where 2 children, for instance, killed someone who was Abu Jahl because he insulted Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. Children. And then the story is told in a way that makes killing him at the hands of 2 Muslim children, to use the words of the curriculum, only natural and just. And Jews, anti-Semitism is very much rife in this curriculum and the worldview of this whole kind of ideology are constant targets for hatred in the curriculum of the Muslim Brothers. So I'm just quoting from 1. Jews are the enemies of God. The Muslim knows that the Jews are characterized by all evil, for they are cowards, traitors, and cannot be trusted. And finally, you have da'wah as core to radicalization. And here, basically, it's very important to understand that we're talking about ideology, but it's functioning because of the manner by which it spread that message. And at the core of it is a religious message, a very much missionary type of propagation. So it is the religious indoctrination that comes with it, the da'wah, missionary work that provides a strong, uncompromising religious foundation. The most important thing is to understand that with that, this da'wah is also supported by a transnational network flushed with money and resources. I'm coming to an end right now, and I just want basically to conclude by saying this is a problem that concerns us all. If you look at the numbers, just sheer numbers, those who are suffering more, the number of victims that fall because of this type of Islamism, the majority of them are living in Muslim majority countries. We are in this together, but we are supposed to find solutions to this problem. And by not looking at the issue or by talking about it by not addressing the problem and the issues, we end up with a situation where it's like the problem will continue, and we will basically end up with much bigger problem, because we are paving with our silence the ground for polemic far-right groups. And I just basically urge you, just as you stand up to neo-Nazis, to populist, far-right groups, fascist groups, do us the courtesy of standing also up to the same type of religious far-right group, because this is a far-right group. The only difference, it has to do with religion. I appreciate your listening, and I do hope that this was interesting.
So we're going to do a Q&A now. I'm going to walk around. If you just raise your hand, I'd ask that you just stand up and ask your question. We have a pretty small group, so I think we can probably get through all or most of the questions.
Thanks for coming out. So my question is, as it pertains to the peace process in the Middle East and how Islamism sort of relates to that, because inevitably Al-Aqsa is going to have to be part of a final status solution. That's something that is just too important to not consider. So, I think many people, they look at the paradigm as just Israelis versus Palestinians, two people living in the same place who are trying to, work out but I tend to think it extends a little bit further than that. I don't really think it's a struggle between two peoples. It seems to me to be between Israel and the Arab and Muslim world, because you have, indoctrination in Iran. This is going on. It goes on all across. I studied abroad in Kazakhstan, and I had people were telling me things, what they felt about Israel. This is a much more secular country, but Islamic culture. So, do you think that the sort of foreign policy we should be addressing are the countries that have much more power over defining the doctrine? For example, a country that controls 2 out of the 3 holy sites, Mecca and Medina.
Okay, so the question is, do we have to basically address Saudi Arabia, you mean?
As at least as the main culprit that is exporting all of this, because the Wahhabist doctrine is coming from Saudi Arabia, and it's spreading across. So it seems that we should probably target the biggest promulgators of this message, and it seems to be Saudi Arabia. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
I agree with you that Saudi Arabia has been a part of the transnational network in propagating Salafi Islam worldwide. But not only Saudi Arabia. You look at private donors in Kuwait, for instance, it seems to be really a very strong transnational Salafi movement there, and really supporting other groups. Qatar is very problematic in the way it supports not only Salafis, but also Muslim Brotherhood, and it's very active. Now, the good news, you see certain changes taking place in Saudi Arabia, okay? And with this new prince, I'm not saying we will have democracy. I think anybody who think that we will end up with a democratic system there is fooling him or herself. What I'm saying, basically, there are certain tendency by this new emir, crown prince, that might lead to a reverse of the aggressive measures that led to the propagation of this Wahhabi, the societal Islamism. And you see it actually, there's a certain indication, I'm not really sure, I'm reading too much in it, but for instance, in Belgium, the whole problematic situation in certain closed communities like Molenbeek in Brussels has to do with infrastructure that were built by Saudi Arabia in cooperation with the government of Belgium. And just lately, the government of Belgium reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia to stop financing that great mosque and training the imams. Because the problem is basically that led to a horrible kind of indoctrination that took place and led to the closeness of the society of Molenbeek within Moroccan migrants mainly. So yes, I think there must be a certain kind of direct talk and actions demanding a stop of financing coming from countries, whether from Gulf countries or from Pakistan, okay, or Turkey now. And that would mean more kind of like laws. This is like I'm demanding within Switzerland, and I'm not the only one. We have like other members in the movement who are demanding laws that stop the flow of money from Gulf countries to the mosque that we have, that we be able to finance these mosques alone, you know? So I guess that's would be one way of looking at it.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I just wanted to ask about a writer, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I just wanted to know what you think of her ideas around Islam and the whole reform movement. And I've also realized that here in the United States, there is a tendency, because as you spoke in the beginning, I really love what you said about the gray area being in the middle. There's a tendency of right-wing media to listen to people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali a lot more than the left. Mm-hmm. And first of all, what do you think of Ayaan Hirsi Ali?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure you know the background of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. This is like and the horror that she lived through. Okay, so from that perspective, I understand the background where she comes from. In the book, I actually mentioned her among the group that basically, because I said in the book, you have those who say Islam is the problem and those who say Islam is not the problem. And then you have those, which I belong to, and I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali also belongs to, who are saying, yes, religion is a problem, but what made it mainstream in that respect? What made this fundamentalism mainstream? Okay? So from that perspective, when I said the Medina form of Islam, okay, there was an article that I wrote in 2012. I'm not the first who said that. There is a well-known Sudani scholar, Mahmoud Taha, who talked about two sides of Islam, Medina Islam and Mecca Islam. The Mecca Islam, more or less, is like showing two sides to the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad. One that is peaceful, one that is more or less like a warlord. Okay? Mahmoud Taha said that in Sudan, he wanted with that to find a reform of the religion. He got killed because of it. They hanged him for it, executed him for it. I wrote something similar in 2012 in Arabic, and while I'm doing this work for this book, I read a similar article from Ayaan Hirsi Ali in 2015 in Foreign Policy. So with that, I'm saying her arguments are valid. Her arguments are valid. She is trying to fight Islamism. I don't agree with everything she might say, but nevertheless, I think we have common grounds to work with. And at the same time, I find it very problematic, the polarization that we have here. And what I said at the beginning, that we are actually, through that polarization and through the fact that we don't want to talk about the problem of Islamism, we end up in a situation where we do not, in fact, where we start to undermine important human rights values, freedom of expression. When you end up that Ayaan Hirsi Ali is not allowed to speak in certain universities, that's censorship. You don't like what she says, she's saying, listen to her, argue with her. But when you end up in the United States, that you cannot speak in campuses because you don't like what I'm saying, that's a problem. That's a real problem.
There's also a sense that because the left doesn't want to listen to what she has to say, she's been sort of hijacked by the right. Like she's more on Fox News and I feel like there is a certain ease to hate on that side because it's a media that's watched by Christians in America and right-wing Christian, all of that. And it's easier for them to listen to that because there is a sort of, Muslims are not that welcome for them. Like, listening to somebody who's saying things against Islam is easier for them than, people in the left. I don't know if that makes sense.
And she is as well an ex-Muslim, and she has every right to be an ex-Muslim. And the most important thing, from my perspective, if we are talking about reform within our societies, you cannot exclude the ex-Muslims. And I've been saying that in my writing in Arabic, because it's that we have to include everybody, Muslims, non-Muslims, ex-Muslims, people within all of those who are living in these societies and never are treated as citizens, because it's reflected in how we are treating our citizens. So for reform, you need every voice, and what she went through is just
thank you for the speech. I really enjoyed it. But as a Southern person, whenever I have this type of conversation, it automatically becomes polarized. Like if I'm having if I'm criticizing extremist Islam, it's automatically assumed that is a racial statement. So my question is, how would you advise me in having these conversations so that the conversation doesn't become so polarized? How we can have just a critical discussion rather than just a series of insults going back and forth. Yes. Sorry if that...
No. It's just basically... I'll tell you what I usually do. What I usually do is have a very differentiated kind of argument. Very often people react because of their sense of fear, and they feel they're being attacked. As you're saying, basically, you start to speak and they immediately, whatever you're saying is not even being heard, it's being taken as an attack. And I would basically focus on the expression that I used. This is a religious far-right group. And it's an ideology, but unfortunately is based also on a fundamentalist reading of Islam. It doesn't represent Islam. As it's like, you have more than 57 countries of Muslim majority countries. Islam is a civilization, is people, is different readings of religion, But the type of interpretation that I'm talking about used to be fringe, not anymore after the 70s, And with that, once you put it in that perspective, it becomes clear that this far-right, religious far-right ideology has consequences. And the most who would suffer under this ideology are people living, whether in closed communities here or in Muslim majority countries. So always do it with respect and differentiated manner. I think that's the best way. And I hope people will understand that you're a concerned citizen. Yes. May I ask him first, because I saw his hand before, and then you.
Who was it?
Hi, thank you for coming today. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I couldn't hear, couldn't
I know
hear
you
the
can't hear,
report.
so they-
Yes. Anyway, the political right in America seems to believe everything you believe. Can you tell me what you think they're doing wrong?
They don't see it as an ideology. They see it Islam. I'll put it this way. When I hear sometimes the discussion that I hear sometimes from certain center speakers, it's like I have the impression sometimes Islam, Muslims, terrorism seems to be one. Did I get it right?
Well, the National Review is a conservative magazine. No, you're probably familiar with that. They call it an ideology.
Okay.
What in your mind do you think the American political right, where do you think they're making their big mistake? A man says that they hijacked this woman that you were talking about, which I haven't read her book, but did they wrap her in a blanket and carry her off to the Fox News studio? Or did they just invite her in because they happen to believe what she believes?
Yes, so they happen to believe in what she believes. May I tell you something? It's like you consider Trump to be part of the right, right?
No, not really.
Okay, good.
We think he should have run as a Democrat.
Okay.
Well, think of the amenities he'd get. You know, that he's not getting now, you know, so no, he's not really. He gave a lot of money to the Democrats before he ran as a Republican. So not a real Republican, not a Reagan Republican.
I'll put it this way. If I have a problem...
Sorry.
No, not at all. Not at all. With the... I have a problem with the way... I'm not really talking about the right here, but I have the problem with Republicans when they seem to focus on contracts, oil contracts, armed contracts with Gulf countries, criticizing Islamism, but not taking the steps with it. Tell me which groups are from in the right now, in the political spectrum, who are willing to take a stand against Qatar. Qatar. This is the one who's financing Muslim Brotherhood today. And in UK, no one, even from the right, the Tories, dare you to ask them to do something about Qatar or Gulf countries. And with all due respect, yes, it's like I see sometimes when I listen to how the political right are arguing, I think, okay, we might actually talk with each other. But they're very much realist in the approach when it comes to the interests of the state.
Do you think Americans, with their budding no longer dependence on foreign oil, coming probably by 2021 or 22, is going to maybe change that?
I think right now it's changing anyway, you know, and I don't think it's actually a deliberate or conscious move from the side of the United States. Things are changing anyway, globally, you know. But the Qatar issue, from my perspective, is yet to be addressed. The way, when we talk, is everybody is like criticizes Salafi Islam, and then no one is doing anything about the money that is coming and financing these mosques. And from that perspective, you're very right. I don't think the political right say it the way I said it. I'm not really sure. Other than that, I have really to review what I'm saying, you know. But I believe in that. I actually, and it's based on research. It's not that I invented this, okay?
Thanks, Andy. I think we've all heard that Islam is a religion of peace. And while I'm not a very big fan of Islam, I do recognize that it does have some very peaceful passages within its texts. Do you believe that these peaceful sections of the holy text can come back like they were in the 70s and re-enter mainstream Islamic ideology?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Islam can be both.
gain in vogue again, though?
I think
foresee
yes.
that?
I think the book is telling us, if there's a message that I'm hoping to come across, is that there were structures, there were strategies, a system that mainstreamed this radical form of Islam. And that means, just as you mainstreamed it, you can reverse it with certain specific measures. But that said, from my perspective, and I'm not really sure that some would agree with me, I have the impression we have a daunting task within Muslim majority countries where we basically, at the end, we have to come up with a free form of religion. And that won't be done without addressing the human nature of our holy text. And I say that in Arabic, just as I say it in English, just as I say it in German. So it's not that I'm saying that for your own pleasure.
And I definitely agree with that as an ideal, but just like pragmatically, I guess my question is, how do you think that lines up with the idea of Quranic obligation and sort of the idea that, you know...
It's just once you address the fact that Quran it's like the spoken word of Muhammad written by humans, okay? And you lately there was there was a huge project done after 10 years of research by a Tunisian professor, Sharafi, where he published more than 2,000 pages Quran with its different readings. And he showed how the readings are different. Because so far, we've been speaking about Quran as if basically were spoken by God. Okay? He, just like others, but his work is very important, has shown that in fact, no, there's a human factor there. And once we basically acknowledge the human nature of our holy book, we will be in a position to say, yes, that's in the Quran, but with all due respect, that reflect a different history. Because I think if we have a church, it's the Quran. We have to separate our Quran from our life, at least when it comes to Sharia.
So I come from a background of philosophy, and basically one of my biggest beliefs is that philosophy is one of the ways that we can engage people through, regardless of how radically different they might live their life or, just think about the world. And I particularly believe that there's a way that we can approach people that are, I think one of the things that really struck me about your experience is that, I really feel like I understand, following down a path. You're young. I'm only 23 myself, and you find yourself, confused. But the interesting thing was you found your way out of it. And for me, philosophy had a really big part in that. And so my question is, do you think that philosophy can have a role in touching people that are in a dangerous place?
Critical thinking. Critical thinking is very important. And notice something. All of these forms of Islamism, they frown upon philosophy. They consider it as just like you can't basically learn philosophy. They stopped teaching us philosophy because of the influence of Islamists. And that shows you why, because it's like philosophy is critical thinking. And with critical thinking, you can actually dare to ask. So yes, I think philosophy, poetry, life, beauty of life, colors, art,
As a
all
follow-up,
have a place.
Yeah, absolutely. As a follow-up question, do you think that there's a way that philosophy can always be useful regardless of how far a person becomes radicalized? Or do you think that there's a point where somebody's just too sort of gridlocked in their way of thinking, almost like, in a house that they've boarded themselves up in?
No, I meant it is basically I think once a person is radicalized, there are other means to de-radicalize a person. And philosophy is not the, I wouldn't think it's tool at that point. I came from a context where I was actually raised on a critical thinking because of my father. You know, my mother was the believer. My father was the one who basically always gave me a critical reading of everything, you know. And I think when it comes to a person who is radicalized, you really have to also show the contradictions in whatever they're saying, because what they are telling us is a history that never existed. A history really that never existed. And you can show without any problem that whatever they're saying, with all due respect, is not based on facts. It's an idealized kind of ahistorical, utopian past that they think we should go back, despite the fact that it never existed.
Thank you. If I am correct, I understood you correctly, then you are separating two things, like it is not problem with fundamentally with Islam, it is problem with radicalization. And but at the same time, you are giving teaching from which are basic in Islam, like from Quran and from saying of Prophet, like Hadith. And throughout Muslim history, they were never peaceful, like not big era of peace. And they all the time use these teachings to motivate people to kill each other. Then why are not we accepting that there is problem with this religion can be misused, and there are both kind of things like good and bad. And of course we are human being and we know good things, and those are there in everywhere. In every religion, every human being knows. But other things we can disagree, which motivate people to kill each other, those are part of Islam. So why we are not accepting that Islam is a problem? Instead we saying that no, only radicalization is problem, only after 70s this is problem. Why we are saying this? And second question is, in country like Pakistan, like more than 90% are people which you are saying that they are taught, and yeah, they are taught in textbooks, same material. So my question is, in that kind of society, how can we talk? You cannot even deliver this kind of speech over there. Okay, you cannot give that talk. So we cannot even talk because we lose our friends, we lose our family. And even when something is really rational and sensible or critical. So in that kind of society, how can we play a role? So like you said that this is problem, we need to talk about this. But in that society, we cannot even talk. You know about Bangladesh, even blogger got killed. Pakistan is kind of same situation, blogger got kidnapped. And army is part of problem because they are using religion for their interests. So how can we make change over there?
Yes.
So these two questions.
Yes. I really hope the book will come in English, you know, because right now it's published in German. But you will see that in the book, I have a whole chapter with this question. I am asking, is Islam the problem? And I present the argument of those who are saying Islam is the problem. Islam is not a religion of peace. And the argument of those who are saying, no, Islam is a religion of peace. I tend to be a part of a group who are saying religion is part of the problem. However, we also have to look at the structures that mainstream a certain reading of Islam. Now, with that, I'm not arguing that there are sides of this religion that are very violent, okay? I'm not arguing with that. But I see it in all religions. And so all you have to do is to look in other religions. And then you see that in each religion, you have the message of peace and the message of violence. Once you put the question in that frame, you see the political dimension of it. And once you see it, remember Pakistan. What happened there? It was supposed to be a state for Muslims. but a state of citizens for everybody living there. But then you had a state that allied itself with Islamists, and then you started a kind of not only you changed the society through the reading of Deobandi Islam and the teaching of Jama'ah Islamiyah. And you ended up with a situation that in the 70s, you change a constitution and tell people, like Ahmadiyya minority, you're not Muslim, despite the fact that you call them all the time Muslims. And according to the constitution, any Ahmadi cannot call himself or herself as a Muslim, otherwise this person will be imprisoned for 5 years. So the political dimension is crucial, the political dimension, because it's the one that actually mainstreamed that. It's not that you would, our societies, look, before, you have a situation where tolerance was actually widespread in certain periods of our lives. Today, that tolerance doesn't exist anymore. In Egypt, I was born in Al-Mahalla Al-Kubra, in a building where Christian and Muslims lived together. They actually celebrated everything together. And I know, just like many people tend to look at previous periods with such idealized eyes. But nevertheless, it was actually a time when we accepted each other. We accepted each other. But that changed. Today, you have an argument that tells you, don't eat with Christians. You can't eat with them because of the Salafi reading of Islam. And if they get killed in a church by a terrorist act, everybody criticizes it, but dare you to say, God bless the soul, Allah yarhamhum. Because the argument is basically, you can't ask for blessing for the non-believers. And the same person who's criticizing the act of violence doesn't see the contradiction in what he or she is saying with that. And with that, I'm just saying there's a political dimension. And with that, we need basically to work on it. So, yes, Islam can be a religion of violence, but it can also be a religion of peace. It's what you make of it.
Hi. Hi. First of all, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciated your presentation. When you're telling us about your time, as a teenager and how you didn't want to wear the hijab and woke up, it got me thinking about Linda Sarsour, who is the leader of the Women's March. In the past, she has obviously, openly called for jihad against the president and said incredibly anti-Semitic things about the media. Yet she is such a prominent figure in the Women's March movement, and even openly said that wearing the hijab is actually empowering for women. And with that being said, my question is, do you think that her position in such a prominent movement could have a negative impact on not just the Women's March, but also women's rights in general? And if so, what do you think we could expect from that?
It's a very good question. Let me put it this way. It seems from what I've been following that she is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, if I'm correct. Okay? It seems to be the situation. But that said, I'm actually, I would expect Linda Sarsour to say whatever she's saying. What I have problem with is how the movement on the other side, embracing her, is actually embracing her, and that's indicative of what I would call, it's not only white man's burden, it's an essentialist paradigm, post-colonial, post-modern paradigm, where very often many people feel like it's a racist way of looking at a person. You're looking at me, you don't see Elham Manea, a Swiss citizen of Yemeni Egyptian roots, an academic, a human rights activist. What you're seeing is a Muslim. You see me as a Muslim first. And as a Muslim first, you don't see any parts of my identity. You just think that I'm reduced to this religious identity, and a Muslim do certain things. She covers her head. She doesn't engage in sex before marriage. She doesn't drink alcohol. It's a very interesting way of looking at people as group, and as group who are represented by their most conservative elements. And with that, and with their white man's burden, where they feel all the time guilty, we've done so much horrible things in the world, they take whatever she's saying at face value. Okay? I think Linda Sarsour also mentioned Sharia and praised the Sharia in Saudi Arabia. With all due respect, it's not Saudi Arabia. I'm just talking about a jurisprudence that was basically done between the 7th and the 10th century, where slavery was part of reality. And from that perspective, it actually infringed on human rights. And I find it very interesting that what she says seems to be taken at face value. Headscarf. Headscarf is the marketing, it's a trademark of the Islamist movements. And in the book, you will see how they actually systematically work in any society. When they start with the headscarf, control of the woman, her body, okay? Why women are wearing headscarf, that's another issue, because you have difference in terms of like their motives. You have young women here in European and North American context who are searching for their identity, as I was searching for my identity, and then they find it in the religious identity. And part of that religious identity, because the message always comes, you have to wear the headscarf to be a Muslim. A real Muslim should do that. So she will wear it thinking, really, that's what God wants, okay? You have those who are doing it as a defiance. Just a second. You're calling me Muslim? I'll show you. You know? But it's a defiance against their own parents who don't wear headscarf. Okay? You have those, what I saw in Egypt, who wore it because they didn't want to spend money on their head. I mean it, to go to the coiffeur. You know, so you see, there are different reasons. So when I see a woman with a headscarf, I respect her choice. I have a problem with children wearing headscarf in schools. And here one has to basically insist. Children are children. You want to wear this headscarf, then do it basically when you reach the age of majority. And it made me really angry when I saw in the Women March, which actually I supported, and then I saw that headscarf as a kind of like a marketing, when they had this with them, with the American flag, you know, a beautiful woman with the American flag as a headscarf. And I wrote an article in English, in Huffington Post, protesting it, because it's unfortunately, because there's another motive for women to wear the headscarf, and it's social pressure and patriarchal structures, where women are forced to wear it as well. And when that is the case, don't use a controversial symbol for something that is supposed to unify people. It's like you have those who are forced to wear it, just as those who tell you we're doing it by free will, good for you. But not all are doing it by free will. Okay?
Hi. Thank you for coming. Just ask you a question. But can Islam really be a religion of peace? Because what were to happen if I were to say, if I were to insult a prophet? What is the punishment that says in the Quran about insulting the prophet?
What is the punishment in Islam for what?
If I insult a prophet, if I insult Prophet Muhammad, what is in the Quran that would say that?
The Quran will not say anything. It's just like, honestly, but you have a hadith.
Just that they will be in Tahajjud, so people will follow it. So, or do all religions, do all Muslim sects and denominations follow Tahajjud?
al-hadith,
Hadith.
the saying of Muhammad.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, of course, the Sunnah is, they take the hadith, these are the sayings of Muhammad, which were written 200 years after his death. Seems to be taken, yes, many are taking it at its face value, although you have certain kind of movements right now, not only criticizing the hadith, but they saying our only source is the Quran. They are called al-Quraniyun. It's a reform movement.
Okay.
Yes?
No, yeah, that was the question. It's just that that seems to be like a little bit of a litmus test for right now for Islam. So I think that is very, very good answer. Because insulting the Prophet if incites violence does not help evolve. Because in the United States, I can just criticize the Vatican, the Pope or the leader or the Prophet of like the Latter-day Saints, and I can say anything, and people go like, no, okay. But if I insult Prophet Muhammad, suddenly people go like, ooh, and the tension of the room rises. Yeah. So that is an essential part. Is there any specific way? Okay, so what kind of denominations and sects are not following the Hadith? That's how I know how to say it. I'm sorry. You keep on correcting me, but I don't know how to say it right. What kind of Islam denominations are not following the Hadith? Do you know, or, because this is the first time I ever heard that they're not following the Hadith.
Oh, yes, the Quraniyun, they don't follow the Hadith. It's a reform movement, as I said. It's a modern reform movement, and they don't follow the Hadith. But many right now, it's like, please don't forget the differences in the denominations. The Sunnah, they look highly to the Sunnah, to the Hadith of Muhammad, but then the Shia will pick and choose what they want when it comes to a Hadith. That said, I agree, actually, that you have a problem with the issue right now of criticizing Muhammad or even painting him. But unfortunately, my problem is more with the reaction that we're having here when we start to censor ourselves rather than saying we will insist on our freedom of expression, including painting the Prophet of Islam, because if you actually budge, what you are actually doing is succumbing to the worst, to those who are actually committing these violent acts. It's like the Charlie Hebdo. It's just, for God's sake, some people came and killed these journalists. Instead of like criticizing it, you start to criticize the journalists who drew it. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So what I'm saying is just that, of course, you will have, specifically right now, you talked about Pakistan, and also even the Sufi Barlevi group within Pakistan. They respect Muhammad in a way that they were at the forefront when it came to attacks against those who insult Muhammad as a prophet. And that shows that you have a certain problematic dimension, The question is, how do we deal with it? It's like, from my side, I'm doing what I have to do, I'm working with others, trying to find a way out, okay? But here, you have to insist on your freedom of expression. You have to really make sure that you don't dilute that. Because these are, for God's sake, you have people in Arab and Islamic countries paying with their life because of their fight for this freedom of expression. Raif Badawi, the blogger, the Saudi blogger, still in prison until today. Bangladesh bloggers, secular or ex-Muslims, they were hacked. And they insist on this freedom of expression. So when we come here, I says, please, it's like, protect it.
Use it or lose it, right?
Huh?
Use it or lose it.
Use it or lose it.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I'm a strong believer of freedom of speech, and I believe that if I say Prophet Muhammad is a jerk in Saudi Arabia, I totally deserve to get killed.
No, you
Totally.
don't deserve to be killed there.
Because the Quran is like the law
No,
and
you
everything
don't
else.
deserve. That's
I
what I'm
don't deserve
saying.
it at all?
It's like these are
Okay.
universal human rights.
Thank you. I do agree.
And they should be respected in Saudi Arabia and also here. They should be applied everywhere. So even if you said it in Saudi Arabia, with all due respect, it's like you have someone who actually criticized Muhammad, and he was 16 years old, you know. Until today, he's basically in prison. And haram كده. And there's also a woman afterwards. Sorry. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about that.
First female. I think the real problem is that we're all human beings. You know, we have emotions, and how many of us really get along with all our own family members, people at work, someone who's always controlling someone. And when we look at history of mankind from the beginning, before Christianity, before Islam, before Judaism, before all of that, it has been a violent history. It's been about money, control, ego, and land and woman. And we have, human beings have found a way to use religion. Religion, God did not create religion. Human beings did it. Christianity, Hinduism, so many. And there's some good aspects to religion. It gives people hope when there is no hope. It gives people, something to hang on to. But then there are those who use it for violence. Because, we are inclined towards violence. There's pathological disorders. Mm-hmm. Medical textbooks have defined it. And we may have a president of the United States who may suffer from psychological disorder. Okay. Different reality, right? Well, yeah. Lying, we all think, politicians are all liars, so forth. These are human characteristics. And when you think about it, if, say, you are do you really need religion to know that it's wrong to kill a person? Mm-hmm. It's wrong to lie. It's wrong to steal. And if I am someone who thinks it's wrong, and some religion comes and tells me to go kill someone, I'm not going to do it. Mm-hmm. Okay?
So, you know what? I agree. It's that we have different opinions about religion. And while I'm talking about this, I'm talking about an ideology based on a religious interpretation. That's why I'm insisting. Forget about your opinions about religions. Whether you agree with belief or not, faith or not, put it on one side. Yes, this religion needs reform. What I'm saying, however, we are dealing with a religious far-right ideology. We have to face it. That's what I'm saying. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not only religion we're talking about here. You have to read the literature of these authors. And when you read it, Mein Kampf of Hitler will go a little bit in the shadow. And I mean it.
You could say the same thing of the Bible.
Yeah, you can say.
But that's not the Quran I'm talking about.
Okay, you can.
I'm talking about
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying that somebody could bring the same argument for the Bible, because I agree with you on religion, when they say this.
You don't have the microphone right now.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can say the same thing about Christianity. You can say the same thing about it. And, just as a background.
These are two, with all due respect, we're talking about different kind of levels. It's like.
Okay, one thing. Okay. I come from a Muslim background.
Okay.
My family, I was born in India. Muslim, okay? I have read the Quran. I've read the Hadith. My father sent me to a Catholic school, okay? He wanted me to learn about other religion and respect. And so I grew up in a Muslim family. My family, my cousins, uncles, aunts, they're all Muslims. And so I do understand what you're saying. I mean, I have spent many years studying the Quran. You know, I'm not an Arabic speaking person, but, you know, as a non-Arabic speaking person, I learned to read the Quran in Arabic. And then I went on to study the Quran. So I totally understand what you're saying, that yes, there's certain, you know, there's things that are taught that is problematic, that needs to be addressed. And to characterize, I mean, the Islam that I was raised, that I grew up, this was in the 70s. To date myself, I'm 46, okay.
I'm 52.
You know, my parents, Muslims, never read the Quran, did not know what Hadith was. And the Islam that I was raised, it was the peaceful, the loving,
The Mecca Islam.
you know, you don't hurt someone, you know, feed the poor, all those virtues. And I went to a Hindu school. Same thing was taught in, you know, Hindu school. I had friends who were Hindu. I went to a Catholic school. Same thing, except, you know, I learned that Islam taught me, you know, way to heaven is to believe in one God. And in Catholic school, I learned, well, way to heaven is through accepting Jesus as the Son of God.
Savior.
Yeah, Savior. What's your follow-up? And so I understand what you're saying, but I think the problem that, you know, living here now is terminology that we use. The definitions, I mean, they are important. And to say that Islam is a violent religion, well, yeah, two people can read the Quran, one turns to peace, the other one turns to violence. And the same thing can be said about anything. So yes, we do need to talk about it, and I agree that we have to address what is going on globally. But my concern is when we start saying Islamization, you know, whatever, I can't even say that word, Islamization or whatnot, that is leading to more, not a way of peace, because then we're characterizing the entire religion.
No, I didn't do that. I don't think I did that. No, I really didn't do that. And when you talk about an ideology based on a religious interpretation, it shows a differentiated way of looking at this issue. It's not that I'm saying Islam is a religion of violence, and I'm also not saying Islam is a religion of peace. I'm saying Islam is what you make of it. And at the same time, what is being mainstream lately is the Medina version of this religion. And problematic is that we are dealing with an ideology. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the people, I'm not talking about the religion, I'm talking about an ideology. And I believe by not addressing it, by not talking about the problems, by not showing that we are actually dealing with an ideology, a far-right ideology, Islam will be hijacked. The religion itself will be hijacked because they have hijacked it so far, you know. And our inability to discuss that in a differentiated way, but at the same time without being afraid of saying where the problems are. So you really have to read the literatures. Hassan al-Banna, Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, Sayyid Qutb, all of these, Khomeini, just read what they say. And then you realize this is something that took the shape of religion, but it is a religious ideology, and I cannot help it if it's that way. You just have to deal with it, you know? And yes, the Islam that I knew in Egypt was the peaceful one, the Mecca type of Islam. And many people living in this globe of Islamic faith, when they practice their religion, they practice it the Mecca way, the peaceful way, But the spread of Salafi Islam, and we see that not only in Indonesia and Malaysia today, it's changing societies, dividing society. And the most who are suffering under that are the minorities. So from that perspective, with all due respect, I don't see that I'm actually contributing to violence here. I'm trying to find solutions.
And from there,
No, he wanted to say something, and then so please, I'm sorry about that.
Well, thank you. This may have already been covered, but I just kind of want to clarify it in my head. Is it easier for, say, a non-believer of any religion to have these kind of conversations versus a person of some religious background trying to change the mind of someone else? Does that make sense?
I didn't get it, I'm sorry.
Okay, so I'm a non-believer in any religion. So if you want to have this conversation to what you're suggesting for us to have, is it any easier for a non-believer to have these discussions versus a person who is coming from a belief system?
I honestly believe that we are human beings, and regardless of our belief or of or no belief, we have every right to be part of this discourse and discussion. It's just how we do that. And at the end of the day, it's just, if I'm just repeating what I said before, we are in this together. And that means everybody, Muslims, non-Muslim, ex-Muslims, those who are living in this society. Of course, we are all part of this society. We have to be part of this discussion. Yes? Okay, خلاص.
how many more do you want to do?
I don't know about the time.
On his point, actually, it was interesting. Non-believers versus believers. I was wondering, first of all, two-part question. CARE. Do you consider them an Islamist organization, by the way?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
As far as I understand, there's an affiliation of Muslim Brotherhood. Am I wrong in that?
I think so, but I
Okay.
wasn't sure where you were coming from. In the characters who criticize Islam or Islamism, migrations into Europe, the ones who are non-believers, for example, in Europe, Douglas Murray and Tommy Robinson, and then in the United States, people like Bill Warner and Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller types. At what point do they get so far to the right that they're not good actors? Some of us who aren't that educated about all the issues, might feel, they're saying some truths. But then you have other people, these are Nazis or right-wing, they're white nationalists. It's hard for an average person to really know who to believe. Are they being slowly indoctrinated into one side or another? I'm wondering what your opinion about some of these people are, where you kind of put them in a spectrum. Are they contributing positively in any way? Are they actually doing more harm than good? Things like that.
Well, honestly...
Douglas Murray being one of them, I find a little bit more intellectually, seems to be more legitimate, but...
No, I'll tell you what. Just as I stand against this religious far-right group, I stand against also far-right groups, okay? Whichever their beliefs. And you have some who, when you look at their discourse, you realize it's not really, it's okay, freedom of expression, I defend the right of every person to say whatever he wants to say, okay? But some of what is being said, you realize at the end of the day, it's not about really the critique, but more of a hate of a one group that's being used as a scapegoat. I can't talk about the persons that you discussed. I have to see what they're saying. But I think the one in London, in the UK, his Twitter account was Tommy. Is that, I'm not sure. It's like, I have really it's like certain kind of question marks about where he stands. This
Feeling.
Well,
More than feeling.
a strong feeling, I'll put it this way. Okay, it's, if it's racist, I'll say it's racist, you know. So, and racism should be condemned, you know.
I was more curious Douglas Murray's new book. I haven't read it.
No.
I know you're talking about Tommy Robinson.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I was talking about
Douglas-
Tommy Robinson, not
I'm-
Douglas Murray, because I've read
I'm
Douglas
more interested
Murray.
in somebody like a little bit more intellectually, you know.
Douglas
of a
Murray has
level.
every right to say whatever he's saying.
But I'm curious about his thesis of his book. I haven't read it, but I've heard enough summaries about it, so I have an idea. I'm wondering if you think he is far off in terms of his,
When it comes to migration,
into Europe and.
well, he's got some points. Okay. Put it this way, we have to discuss it another time. Okay.
Well, if I may, I would like to. Can I ask the last question?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think it will be a good segue to the end. How you pointed out that Islamism is also a religious interpretation of Islam, which I find a lot of academics and scholars in this area are not honest about that. And with also your commitment and advocacy for freedom of expression and freedom of belief as a universal human right, how do you then reconcile the fact that by countering Islamism, you're also then countering a way that perhaps significant percentage of Muslims interpret and practice their religion?
Because, as I said before, I think Islam is what you make of it, okay? I'll put it this way. I think Islam is what you make of it. I think I have a responsibility, like many others, to have a stand against Islamism, but it will be very much intellectually dishonest to say that religious interpretation is not part of it, okay? So from that perspective, with all due respect, it's just like it's work based on research. It's work based on reading, you know, on talking with people, on traveling in countries. So from that perspective, I don't see any contradiction, in fact. It's just like I think you can remain, you can have your faith, you know, but understanding at the same time that faith can be also reformed. Religion, because religion is an institution, religion is scripture, and when I see it at that way, then religion is a human construct. And we can reconstruct it from that perspective. I'll put it this way. Yes, so I don't see any contradiction between that and my faith.
Well, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Manea. Thank you very much for coming.